Plan. The United States federal government should abolish qualified immunity for police. The first advantage, police violence and racism. Policing in America began with night watches targeting natives and slave patrols hunting black people. The police protected white wealth and social order based in white supremacy. This legacy infects the institution of policing today. That's Kepler 14. The birth of the American police can be traced back to slavery and the control of minorities. St. Louis police were founded to protect residents from Native Americans. Many South police departments began slave patrols to maintain economic order and punish slaves who were considered property. The similarity between slave patrols and modern American policing are salient. The legacy of slavery did not end after the Civil War. Extreme violence against people of color became even worse. The disastrous legacy persisted even after the Civil Rights Act of 64. People of African descent were more likely to be stopped, suffered beatings, and even murder at the hands of white police. And today, police are armed like soldiers. They kill 1,000 people each year, and black folks are killed in a system of racial are killed most in a system of racial control. That's McClarth and Tuberville 52620. Those who encounter militarized police are far more likely to end up dead. Police officers increasingly look like members of an army prepared to go to war against unarmed civilians. In 2019, police killed over 1,000. 24% were black, even though black Americans make up only 13% of the population. The history of policing is linked to Americans' exertion of racial control. And qualified immunity stops lawyers from taking cases and kills cops with cops with impunity. Cops kill with impunity. That's Reuters 20. The Supreme Court is making it easier for officers to kill or injure civilians with impunity. Unprecedented analysis of court records found that since 2005, courts have shown an increasing tendency to grant immunity in excessive force cases. The trend has accelerated in the recent years. The Supreme Court has nearly always decided in favor of the police. The High Court allowed police to request immunity before all evidence has even been presented. And if police are denied immunity, they can appeal immediately. The officers are always supposed to win, and the plaintiffs are always supposed to win, a professor said. Why are there so many police and shootings? There's no accountability. There's no deterrent lawyers. Lawyers told Reuters they decline cases in large part due to qualified immunity. And repealing qualified immunity will reduce police violence through self-interest. That's Schwerner 1720. Yeah. Qualified immunity has been perhaps the biggest little-known barrier to rectifying constitutional violations. Repealing it will achieve much in a single stroke without needing to legislate complexities of progressive reform. The increasing accountability of video footage or ubiquitous phone cams means the offenses are real, documentable, and easily dealt with if the government is acting in good faith. If we did away with qualified immunity, we'd have a lot less violations of constitutional rights. The practices any police chief knows to be both wrong, but a large advantage overnight. Through human mechanism and risk-reward calculation that calibrates behavior, figuring out what's right and what's wrong just takes accountability. And if the outpressures government and police budgets, it forces accountability. Schweikart 1720. If police departments are footing the bill, the increased liability risk would encourage them to take more steps to prevent abuses. In 2018, Chicago paid $97 million in settlements and judgments involving police misconduct. How much higher would the total have to be if the absence of qualified immunity? I can't say for sure, but I think it's reasonable to expect that increased accountability brought by eliminating qualified immunity would affect these underlying practices. And the plan that forces constitutional rulings that spill up to police training and policy. That's Psalm 6820. One benefit would be to clarify the contours of constitutional rights. Without qualified immunity, it would be more difficult for courts to avoid ruling of merits. Such rules would provide guidance to governments to create policies and trainings for officials and begin dialogue with other branches. And the body politic about shared constitutional principles. Onto framing. Confronting racist police violence is an effective starting point for undermining all forms of oppression, Cohen and Lewis 16. A broader interrogation of American society must begin there. An interrogation that starts with anti-Black police violence can be a diagnostic of much more. It can tell the story of neoliberal governance. Black Lives Matter connects Black struggles within other oppressed peoples and maps entanglements of repression. Black Lives Matter is an acknowledgement of Black poverty and genocide and state violence, and that 1 million Black people are locked in cages. Black, queer, trans folk are a unique burden. 500,000 Black people in the U.S. are undocumented immigrants. Black girls used negotiating chips during war. Black folk living with disabilities bear the burden of Darwinian experiments. These claims highlight security tactics, the circulation of capital across the empire, and make racial state and racial capitalism more material and more vulnerable to change. And reducing structural violence can create positive ripple effects that reduce existential risks. That's Kaczmarek 17. There's something deeply puzzling about the ruining of lives of actual persons for the sake of humanity acting out for a longer stay in the universe. We instead reduce existential risks by indirect means. By doing so, make the world in two ways go better. We would prolong humanity's place in the cosmos, improve the average welfare of people. An indirect approach would contribute to existential risk reduction by curbing the negative ripple effects. Ripple effects affect the far future in significant ways. The network of ripple effects might go so far as counting a country's economy to develop slightly more quickly, or make certain technological or cultural innovations that arrive more quickly. And police violence is the product of larger systems that structural civil society. These systems include racism, capitalism, militarism, and heteropatriarchy. They are the root cause of war, environmental destruction, poverty, and oppression.
All right, are you good for cross-X?
All right. Yeah, I'm good.
Awesome. What's the actor of the AF?
The United States federal government.
Will you care to specify beyond that?
It's Congress.
Congress. Cool. Is the AF sentencing or policing?
We would say it's policing because
Okay, yeah, that's great. If the states have their own qualified immunity rules based on their own state constitutions, how can federal law through Congress change that?
yeah, in instances between like federal and state law, federal law always trumps state law. So like we would say that enacting through the federal government is preferable because of that.
However, okay, that assumes that they're sort of like ruling on the same things, but the Supreme Court ruled that the states can make their own qualified immunity rules. I guess how does the AF overcome that?
Yeah, so basically, even though that the states can make their own qualified immunity rules, they cannot abolish qualified immunity in total.
Um, okay, I don't know if that's true. How does the AF stop thousands of people that are killed by police that aren't necessarily taken to court?
Yeah. So what we would say to this is that that police act in self-interest, and like even though that like yeah, like you can make the argument that not everyone's going to go to court, but that threat of like court action is always in the back of police's mind, and they take that into accountability whenever they interact with black people.
What piece of evidence indicates that?
Yeah, so we talk about that in our Schirner 20 evidence. It says that repealing qualified immunity will reduce police violence through self-interest.
And additionally, we just think like if we're helping some people through like making these court rulings able to occur, it's a good thing.
It's preferable than doing nothing.
The impact of the AF is like reduced over the time of this cross-X. How many people do you actually like impact if not many people have enough money to even go to court in the first place?
Yeah, like that's basically, you're just asking me like the same question. Like we would say that even if like people don't go to court, then that police act in self-interest because there's still that threat that they could go to court. Also, public defenders exist.
It's going to be the state's counter plan, the federalism dissad, and then I will go to case. First off, the 50 states of the United States should abolish qualified immunity. Solves better. Most affected people are in state systems. That's eyes in 20. Despite the attention the federal system gets, most encounter the system at the county and state level. That is why state reform are so important. States enacted laws of lengthy sentences and contributed to mass incarceration. Crimes cover a narrow range of conduct. State laws cover crimes that are more recognizable. 94% of criminal cases are at the state level. Jails are run by local governments, and states could make a huge dent in the prison population by passing reforms. Next off. Federalism is high now. Court rulings support state authority. That's Gardner and Miller 18. Federalism shapes the structure of police operations. The Supreme Court has ruled that the 10th Amendment bars the federal government from issuing mandates to state and local police. Police participation in a federal initiative requires the consent of the affiliated state or local government. The AF reverses state leadership over criminal justice reform, which is the long recognized bedrock of modern federalism. That's Barco 5. The federal system based on the bedrock premise that the states bear the primary responsibility for criminal justice policy. States define crime set sentences. Long recognized criminal justice is at the core of state, not national responsibility. Important for Congress to pay close attention to federalism values when considering sentencing policy must stay within its appropriate sphere constitutionally mandated wise policy. American federalism is modeled globally. That's Calabrese 95. International federalism has swept across the world in recent years due to the global fascination with and emulation of our own American federalism success story. The global trend towards federalism is an enormously positive development that greatly increases the likelihood of future peace, success on the willingness of sovereign nations to strike federalism deals in the belief that those deals will be kept. The U.S. Supreme Court can do part of this by enforcing vigorously over our American federalism. Federalism solves global war. Best studies. That's Lawadi 9. Cross-national studies covering 100 countries, federalism minimizes violent conflicts whereas unitary structures exacerbate. Among 223 ethnic groups in 100 countries, federalism stifles high-level conflicts. Low-level conflicts. Cohen found high levels of conflicts in centralized politics. Dataset investigated 1,264 ethnic groups. Federalism reduces ethnic violence groups that can influence issues that matter. Broad empirical studies show support claims, foster peaceful accommodation, prevent violent conflicts, provides autonomy, dampen rebellions in Spain, Philippines, Nicaragua, Bangladesh, India, Ethiopia. Federalism undermines militant appeals, builds long-term support for peaceful solutions. Self-managing can be less burdensome for central states, transform destructive conflicts into positive, essential plural countries. Under unitary system, groups' voice are small, knowledge of local problems, regional politics will reduce conflicts arising out of resources. Federalism would bring an end to insurgencies. Federalism keeping a country together by satisfying communities is less need to succeed. Autonomy has not been provided. Civil war, Switzerland, Israel, Papua New Guinea. Case. Existential risks come first. Cognitive bias goes their way. They have no evidence to prioritize probability first. That's GPP 17. Compare peace, war that kills 99%, war that kills 100%. Difference between 2 and 3 is much greater. Earth will remain for at least another billion years. If we do not destroy humankind, these years may only be a tiny fraction of civilized human history. Existential catastrophes would destroy the future. This could be extremely long flourishing, would have extremely large value. Even a tiny probability has a huge expected value. Risk reduction underinvested in, widely indivisibly dispersed. The problem is temporal free riding. The current generation enjoys inaction while future generations bear the cost. Cognitive biases lead people to underestimate risk. Since there have not been any catastrophes of this magnitude, these are not salient with the public. Decision makers are prone to threat risk in a similar way to problems that are less severe. The butterfly effect is wrong. It's a question of how close our internal links are to solving the extinction level impact case. Even if they abolish qualified immunity, most people don't have the money to go to court in the first place. That was in Cross-Ex. AF solves nothing and other factors overwhelm. Cops don't pay legal fees. Unions protect. Juries and prosecutors support cops. That's Greenfield 20. Denying compensation to the victim of a crime comes well after the fact. It doesn't prevent unlawful conduct, but compensation for it. The cop doesn't own defense covered by municipality. The cop doesn't pay the judgment either. Cop unions are forcefully directed towards protecting jobs and pensions. Neither prosecutors nor jurors have demonstrated much to convict a cop. With or without qualified immunity, the first rule of policing would remain intact. Qualified immunity only protects officers in a tiny amount of cases and can easily be overcome. That's Schwartz, 2017. Legal scholars describe qualified immunity in stark terms. The article is first to test the foundational assumption. Just 38% of 979 cases in which qualified immunity could be raised and dismissed qualified immunity grounds. 31 were dismissed at a summary of judgment on qualified immunity grounds. Ruling on immunity fails because of bias on reasonability. That's Wolf 411. Even if the justices limited or eliminated that immunity, police could claim that their actions were reasonable, and what is reasonable, the court usually decides, is in the eyes of the beholder, much to be judged the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene.
What's the status of the off?
The status quo is always an option, which means that if we don't want to go for the counter plan, we are allowed to kick it.
All right, cool. Would you agree that federalism is a balance of power between the states and the federal government, like as a definition?
No, there's the unitary system means that all power is concentrated and the federal government, I guess I do agree.
Okay, how does federalism prevent global war?
Yeah, so our impact card is really good. It comes from a study that analyzed over 100 countries, and one of them had a federalist system, one of them had a unitary system, and they concluded that a system of federalism reduces violent conflict because it allows for more regional politics.
Why has the United States been at war the entire time that it's been alive?
Why? It's about domestic conflict, I would say.
Okay. Why should we prioritize existential impacts over proximate impacts?
So our GPP card says that we have a cognitive bias to underestimate large scale impacts because they've never happened before, which means that risk reduction in itself is kind of underinvested in. So I guess we should focus on magnitude over probability for those reasons.
Okay. When have all the 50 states acted in unison?
I don't know if they have, but there are like systems in place like the National Governors Association that ensured that the 50 states could cooperate over things like criminal justice reform.
Okay. How can the states abolish qualified immunity if it's a federal law?
Like Rishi pointed out in Cross-Ex, it's their state laws as well. So the counter plan would solve better for that because we take into account those state laws.
But wouldn't the perm solve better since it does both then?
It links to the net benefit though.
Okay.
Okay, the order is going to be case, the state's counter plan, and then the federalism decide. Racialized police violence kills 1,000 Americans each year. Ending qualified immunity makes material improvements, and the politics of the 1AC challenges systems of oppression that are the root cause of all impacts. They say that we can't solve for police violence and accountability, but we solve police violence in 4 ways that address the neg's alt causes. First is through self-interest. The plan changes police behavior out of self-interest. That's 1AC Schroeder. This means that the lack of money isn't a problem. The second is constitutional rulings. The plan stops case dismissal. It leads to rulings that shape policing policy. And the third is through civil litigation. Cato and Reuters, Cato and Reuters evidence say that QI stops civil litigation, and DeStefan says that civil litigation solves accountability best. And the fourth is through financial pressure. The AFL pressure budgets forcing accountability. That's when I say Stewart. They say that QI claims are easily overcome, but you can extend our data from Cato. It shows that QI claims were effective 50 to 70% of the times in hundreds of cases, and it quotes Schwartz data. You can also extend Reuters. It says that QI is being granted more each year, and it prevents lawyers from ever taking cases. And Schwartz concludes Schwartz 20. But abolishing qualified immunity is crucial, would draw attention to whether government officials have exceeded their constitutional authority. Qualified immunity decisions signal to police officers shoot first and think later. Courts need to stop sending that signal. They say reasonability, but the plan stops cases from being thrown out before police misconduct is examined and ruled on. That forces more constitutional rulings, which shapes police training, policy, and increased awareness of constitutional rights as per 1AC Salam. And that is only one of the 4 ways we solve police violence. They say to prioritize existential risk, but current risk calculus dismisses the relevance of the persons of color in favor of the greatest good for the greatest number. The problem with this type of calculation is that the greatest number begs a question of who is discounted for not being in the majority. This perpetuates cycles of racial inequalities, and a probability-centered framework best protects future generations. Focusing on short-term tangible considerations leads to learning and unexpected positive developments, which contribute to general human empowerment and helps mitigate catastrophic risks by bringing people together. Let's go to the state's counterplan. Perm do both. It shields the links the net benefit of both do it because it seems cooperation, not federal overreach. And there's a solvency deficit. You can extend 1AC for Verbruggen. The states won't enforce ending QI. And the states can't change federal laws. Sabila 20. The new Colorado law doesn't end the doctrine of qualified immunity. Only the U.S. Supreme Court or Congress has the power to alter or abolish qualified immunity. And federal immunity is easily transferred to local police. Lowry 15. The blanket of federal immunity extends to hundreds, if not thousands, of state and local police officers who participate in federal task forces. An outrageous assertion of federal power. Federal law trumps state law. And 50 state fiat is a voter for 3 reasons. First, it's not real world. The 50 states don't act uniformly ever. And second, it kills topic education. It shifts discussions from actual policy to obscure theory debates. And third, it kills AF ground. They steal 8 minutes of offense without a realistic way to solve the harms that we presented. Now let's go to the federalism dissad. Case outweighs. Systems of oppression are rooted in, are the systems of oppression are the root cause of their dissad impacts, and only the app challenges those systems. And prefer the certainty of our solvency to their speculative link chain. And the dissad is non-unique. Trump has abandoned federalism. State climate change regulations and immigration policy prove. Super 19. Trump abandoned federalism. A federalism that allows states power only to the extent that they agree with the current federal administration is no federalism at all. Federal environmental laws long have given states broad discretion. Trump stripped California of that authority. Emissions controls. Trump threatened antitrust. Justice steps sought to coerce state and local governments to assign their police forces to pursue federal immigration. Serious threat liberties. And federalism empirically isn't modeled. The U.S. law is seen as inapplicable and dangerous. Murkowski 5. Nations seldom look to American model. American democracy prone to corruption. Countries reject the right to bear arms. They abhor the death penalty. The U.S.'s refusal to apply the Geneva Convention to terrorist suspects, to ratify human rights treaties, reinforces that America is out of step with the world. And federalism doesn't solve global war. All the systems they studied only look at internal conflict, not international. That doesn't lead to global war. And there's no spillover because there are different types of federalism. Robinson 15. Federalism should eschew a single theory. There are many federalisms. And federalism in criminal justice specifically perpetuates racism. Miller 10. Federalism was forced as a mechanism for accommodating slavery and facilitated resistance to racial progress after the Civil War. It limits authority to address social problems that give rise to crime. As a result, federalism renders invisible minority victims to address racial inequality in criminal justice. The central government allowed the national government to escape addressing racial progress. Federal system makes it difficult to see disparities in crime and punishment linked to racialized policy making. Okay, I'm good for cross-ex.
I want to start with this Miller evidence. When has the United States federal government been better about addressing racist policy in criminal justice?
Sure. So what we think that you can specifically look to the period after the Civil War, specifically the Reconstruction, when the federal government had a large amount of power over state government, specifically in the South. This helped create like racial justice laws, helped create voting rights, and got rid of black codes in a lot of states. And we think this is an example of how like federal overreach, like in the context of racism, criminal justice, and racial justice and criminal justice can be a good thing.
Okay, the top of the 2AC overview uses the phrase the politics of the 1AC. What are the politics of the 1AC?
Well, we think the politics of the 1AC are like politics that are like about anti-racism, and we believe that one of the ways we can engage in anti-racism like governmentally is by abolishing the qualified immunity standard.
Okay, that makes sense. The second portion of the overview talks about constitutional rulings. What ensures, or like what piece of evidence do you have that says that those rulings won't be ruled in the favor of the police?
Sure. So I'm not sure what piece of evidence says this, but what our AF claims is that through qualified immunity, which is a racially progressive standard, it sets a precedent among Congress to pass more racially standards that that prioritize like victims of police violence rather than the police themselves.
So just to be clear, the rulings create a spillover, which means that Congress will pass more progressive policies.
But that is like kind of what we're saying, but also just because there is a standard for racial justice, like other cases involving things like this will like take a more leftist turn.
The 2NC is the state's counterplan, then case. The counterplan solves all the AF. The counterplan fiats the 50 states abolish qualified immunity, which solves more because states have jurisdiction over criminal justice reform. Our Eisen evidence indicates that they control 94% of all the people in the system. Sufficiency framing. A risk of the net benefit outweighs a minor risk of the solvency deficit, which means you should prefer the counterplan. Judge kick. If you think the perm links to the net benefit, you should judge kick the counterplan. They said perm do both. It links to the net benefit because it does not maintain state power over criminal justice reform. If the states and the government act at the same time, it means that the federal government still has control over criminal justice. But if the states act before the federal government, they can control what CJR looks like, which maintains the bedrock of federalism. Any federal reform will dilute the modeling of federalism. Federal qualified immunity law has created a floor that states can exceed if they choose. This balance is key to federalism. Nielsen and Walker 20. State and local governments can eliminate qualified immunity if they desire. States operate as laboratories of democracy. Federalism allows local policies. This results in better policy. The fact that state governments can do this is important because many of the most important federal rights are clearly established. Thus, the federal floor can be quite high. They say there's no enforcement, but we use fiat. We can fiat that the states enforce the counterplan. There are evidences they won't in the status quo, but it doesn't account for the world of the counterplan. They say we can't reform. Federal follow-on solves and is uniquely likely in CJR. The First Step Act proves, Gleason 19. Dozens of states passed CJR reforms that served as a model under the First Step Act. Policymakers could act on the First Step Act knowing that it was not an experiment, but rather legislation that is grounded in its success on the state level. CJR is one area in particular where states' reforms have successfully percolated up. It's a template. It's wise to use few of the 50 laboratories of democracy first. They say federal qualified immunity. 1. The Supreme Court determined that state courts do not have to enforce federal qualified immunity. Oh, yay. The court held that the defendants do not have a right to an interlocutory appeal from a denial of qualified immunity. State courts did not need to accept the federal definition of final decision. Second, Johnson v. Fankwell is true in the context of qualified immunity. Brown 10. State courts are free to fashion their own rules on interlocutory appeals. They said 50 state fiat is bad. First is our interpretation. The negative gets 50 state fiat. There's a couple reasons to prefer it. First is functional limits. It prevents small apps with no Fed key warrant and focuses the debate on the largest affirmatives with literature-based agent distinctions. Second, it's at the core of the topic. States are an essential part of the CJR process, and they're in charge of prisons and responsible for sentencing. Third, the negative ground outweighs. There are limitless affirmatives. That problem is magnified if the neg loses on the only topic guaranteed generic. Reject the argument, not the team. They said it's not real world. One, there's no bright line as to what is real world and what isn't. The federal government probably wouldn't defund the police, but people still read that AF. Second, there's no impact to this. It also solves topic education better. The debates about theory are consequences of the AFs not debating the content, not the other way around. Next is AF ground. We access better debates about Fed key warrants. Case. I'll start on the framing debate. Magnitude times probability is the only ethical framework for policymaking. Anything else underestimates existential risks. Extend the GPP evidence. Even if they're low probability, saving trillions of lives should be prioritized. Moral uncertainty means you should default negative, because even if they're ahead on the framing debate, the risk that they're wrong is so much worse. That answers their Karnofsky evidence. Their criticisms of utilitarianism do not apply because extinction first is unique, which means that we include minorities in our risk calculation because extinction is universal. I'll go to the proper case debate proper here. I'll extend the Greenfield evidence because there's no clear answer to this coming out of the 2AR. 2AC. Qualified immunity is insufficient to change police behavior because it doesn't change the problem, just the financial compensation for it. Municipalities and police unions fill in and pay for legal fees and insurance. They say they act in self-interest, but self-interest won't be affected if police unions can pay for these legal fees and they can get out of the court cases anyway. Here's more evidence. Even if cops were in courts, majority of juries wouldn't convict them. Solemn 6-8. The vast majority of unsuccessful civil lawsuits fail for reasons other than qualified immunity, which suggests the impact of abolishing it would be less dramatic. Attorneys working for contingency fees have a strong financial reason to eschew such cases. Such rates probably would stay about the same since jurors. This means that the affirmative even if they change the self-interest, they can't because police officers won't necessarily be charged for or convicted. Next, they say constitutional rulings. Crossex was a little bit confusing on this. They have no evidence that says this would actually happen, and there's no sorts of precedents that the Congress can set. Even if the Supreme Court were to rule, they'd probably rule against the affirmative because there's a conservative majority in the status quo. The civil litigation stuff, if we prove that they won't be charged, then they don't access this. Next is budgets. Union budgets outweighs police budgets, which means that they have no access to the insolvency, and there's probably no reason the AF solves.
Are you good for cross?
I am.
Why doesn't federal follow-on link to the federalism decide?
Yeah, the argument is that because states are determining the direction of criminal justice reform, then it maintains states as the bedrock of federalism. However, if the AF happens at the same time as the states, then it means that federal government is acting independently and asserting power over the criminal justice system.
Okay.
Since
there are like different types of federalism in different areas of the government, why is federalism in criminal justice specifically key?
Yeah, I think the Lawadi evidence talks a lot about sort of suppressing rebellions, which are especially important in terms of modeling in unstable regions. Criminal justice reform specifically is key because when governments make broad policies that are supposed to impact everyone the same way, it can't address the specificities of each location that might need a little bit more specific criminal justice, which might cause unhappiness and inequality, which is what causes rebellions in the first place.
Okay. How will the counterplan affect federal police forces?
The counterplan? Well, we argue federal police. I think the argument that's more important is that states control 94% of all the prisoners, and they're in charge of 94% of the criminal justice system. So that first is more important than changing federal policing practices.
What about that 6% of police that do work for the federal government? Those are the police forces that often get sent out to protests and stuff. So
I disagree with the basis of that question because over the summer in Kansas City, most of the police officers there were KCPD. And then also federal follow-on, which was the Gleason evidence that I read in the 2NC, means that the federal government will eventually acquiesce.
Okay, it's going to be the federalism decide. Global American federalism spills over globally and prevents global war. Our Wenensee-Lawadi evidence shows that studies over 100 countries shows that countries with unitary systems are more likely to have high-level conflicts. Federalism assumes and accommodates diverse nation-states and promotes local decision-making and regional politics, which avoids conflict. Absent a model of American federalism, other states have no example. That's our Calabrese evidence. It turns case. A federalist model promotes more equitable decision-making. USFG politics are controlled by gridlock, interest groups, and polarization. Local police reform solves better for those reasons, proves that any risk of a link outweighs, and turns their case. I'll answer their arguments here. The case outweighs argument. A, the framing page proves that magnitude comes first, and B, our turns case analysis assumes that federal government decision-making is worse for minorities because it is slow and it doesn't solve. I'll talk about that later on the turn. The non-unique evidence, the supercard. A, it's just about Trump increasing authority over emission control, not the federalist system broadly. B, the link controls uniqueness, and CJR outweighs. I'll talk about that now. Federalism is high now. Extend Wenensee, Gardner, and Miller. The Supreme Court ruled that the 10th Amendment bars the federal government from creating laws that change state and local police. Police participation in federal initiatives require the consent of local forces, which the Act reverses. The Act reverses it through abolishing qualified immunity for all states and localities and making the Supreme Court reverse their decision on the 10th Amendment. Our Barco evidence says that states have almost complete control of the criminal justice system. CJR is key to federalism because the founders said that the law enforcement was specifically delegated to the states. The Marvarsky evidence, it's only in the context of criticizing US policies, not federalism itself, which means that it doesn't apply to the actual model of federalism. The domestic versus international argument. Domestic conflict spills over. It causes terrorism, the migrant crisis, and other things that ensure global war happens. Think about Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and Nicaragua. It proves that preserving state security is uniquely key. The Robinson 15 card. You should strike it off your flow because only one line is highlighted and it doesn't provide any alternative model to federalism. Even then, there's a risk of a leak. Lastly, the racism first of all, the Reconstruction example failed because the second Reconstruction reversed all policies that happened during the first Reconstruction and proves that federal change doesn't solve. And federalism protects minority rights. Sanctuary rulings prove liberal states are utilizing federalism as a bulwark against Trump. That's Soman 19. This view of federalism contains an important measure of truth. However accurate it may have been in earlier periods, sanctuary city, the Trump era highlights ways its hold no longer true. Trump has led a number of liberal legal commentators to take a more favorable view of federalism. Cut the card at federalism. That was the Solomon 19 evidence.
First off, it's going to be case, and then the federalism DA, and then the state's counterplan. All right. Racialized police violence kills 1,000 Americans each year. Ending qualified immunity deters police violence through self-interest and holds perpetrators of police brutality accountable for their injustices. The affirmative makes a material improvement in the politics of the Wenensee challenge systems of oppression that are the root cause to all of their impacts. Group their no money arguments and their greenfield arguments here. First, qualified immunity sets a precedent that cops don't have privilege over individuals, which materially stops police injustice. And the trial process is long as humiliating, and it's not just monetary. And on their no money evidence, we would say that extend our self-interest argument from the Wenensee, where we talked about it's not just about the actual cases, but also about the possibility of the case. Moving on to framing. The negatives framing is all lives matter rhetoric in response to a detailed plan of action regarding police violence. Prioritizing all lives over the lives of racial minorities means progressive legislation that materially improves people of color's lives are always blocked by Republicans because apparently Russia will nukistically pass the plan. Our critique of utilitarian logic applies since extinction first rhetoric prioritizes the lives of all people in response to politics similar to the one you see. And we turn their framing. We must come up with ways of creating tangible goods for all of humanity, which actually reduces existential threats. The more material good we introduce into the world, the less tension there is, which incentivizes cooperation among citizens and government. That's Kaczmarek from the one you see. We've proven that the app is a material good, which means even if you do buy a race of the next op, you vote after to reduce existential risk beyond the negative impacts. On to the federalism DA. Case outweighs in terms of case. First, structural violence outweighs. Cross-apply that from the framing page. 2, it turns. Racial inequality is what caused tension between states during the Civil War. Even if they do prove that their impacts are true, voting after is preferable since federalism impacts will never happen again. On to uniqueness. This set is non-unique. If their internal link story was true, it definitely would have happened when Trump was president. And the card, they said that the card doesn't apply, but there is an argument to be had here because Trump stripped away California's authority to manage emissions, and there didn't trigger the link. And on the link, there's no link for 3 reasons. First, qualified immunity is a judicial procedure, not having to do with the other branches. 2, if their links were true, any federal law enacted would have led to a great power. Well, it's simply untrue. 3, federalism is about the balance of power between states and the government. The plan is an example of the federal government using its power. And on the internal link, extend the racism turn. Federalism is bad for Black people. Federalism was created to police southern states who relied on forced labor to sustain their economy. Its purpose is to curb legislation that mitigates the damage of slavery. The negative simple extension of this onto the state's counterplan, extend the perm. It's not mutually exclusive. It shields the link to the net benefit. Cross-section the 1AC. If you agree that federalism is the balance of power between states and the federal government. Federalism isn't the states working independent of the federal government. It's cooperation between the two bodies. The perm is the definition of federalism because it repeals qualified immunity on federal and state level, which eliminates any risk of their impacts.
The order is the federalism dissad, the state's counterplan, then framing, then case. A 1% risk of the dissad outweighs the F because they've conceded the majority of the solvency on the counterplan and also sufficiency framing. Strong American federalism solves global conflict. Our Lawadi evidence shows that after analyzing over 100 countries that have both federal and unitary systems of government, federalism is far better. Federal systems can better answer the demands of ethnic groups, provide autonomy, and support for peaceful solutions. They've conceded the impact to the dissad turns the case. Anti-racist police reform solves better at local level because it assumes the specific needs of various communities, promoting better solutions. This is proven through the banning of chokeholds in Colorado or disbanding the police in Minneapolis. This also turns the racism stuff because this proves that state answers are more in tune with the local environment than federal policies. I'll go to the uniqueness debate here. They just extended their California emission stuff without considering the fact that our evidence is more specific. They extend the Gardner and Miller evidence that the 10th Amendment protects local and state officers now from federal rulings. However, the affirmative would reverse this, which is the link debate, and I'll go there now. Our Barco evidence indicates that states have the power of criminal justice, which is the bedrock of federalism. All of their answers are nonsensical. Whether or not it's judicial reform or not doesn't make any sense because it still impacts the broader system of federalism overall. They say the different kinds of federalism, but we have argued that American federalism, basically that criminal justice reform in the hands of the states is the bedrock of that, which means that they still violate it. They say they use federal power, but federalism just describes the balance of power, and they obviously upset the current one that we have, the racism term. Even if the federal government has weaponized federalism to create racist policies in the past, that doesn't mean that federalism is a bad model. 1, they dropped a piece of evidence that Phoebe read in the 1NR. Liberal states have used their power to push back against the USFG. 2nd, they've conceded the progressive federal policies are ineffective because they're usually rolled back. That was an example about the second Reconstruction. They have no answers to these. Go to the counterplan. The counterplan solves all of the affirmative, and it solves more than it. So you should prioritize it over the F, especially considering the net benefit to the dissad, because it has control over 94% of the population of people in the criminal justice system. They say perm do both. It still links to the federal government because when the federal government acts at the same time as the state, it is not cooperation because in no part do we fiat any of that, which means that they don't access the sort of cooperation net benefit that they think solves. It still links because the federal government maintains power over criminal justice system. The states acting alone solves. They say the states can't, but federal follow-on ensures that we can. That was the Gleason evidence that indicates through the First Step Act, the federal government will follow on, especially when all 50 states do it. Framing. I don't need to win case because the state counterplan solves all of it, but you should prefer existential risks outweigh because we solve and turn case for all of their all lives matter rhetoric. They have no reasons why existential risks don't outweigh just the butterfly effect, but it's a question of how close our internal links are to solving.
It'll be case, the federalism dissad, and then the state's counterplan. The fundamental question of this debate is whether Americans should be able to sue police officers for acts of brutality. No matter the framework, the obvious answer is yes. Police should be stripped of qualified immunity to increase accountability and mitigate the racialized police violence that kills thousands of Americans each year. And on their extinction outweighs claims. Extinction First rhetoric is inherently racist because it proposes we take measures to increase state power in response to legislation that helps people of color. Extinction First framing in the real world would mean that all legislation meant to help people would be blocked by legislators claiming that there is some existential risk. And they'll always find an existential risk because because conservative lawmakers have the incentive to block progressive policies. Prioritizing existential risk over everything, especially in real world policymaking, would just stop progressive policies from being passed. We must acknowledge that we can't always be secure, and we must take measures to materially improve the conditions of humanity to prevent existential risks in the future. And materially improving people's conditions is good and helps stop existential and helps stop the threat of existential risk, because a more stable world leads to increased cooperation in scenarios like this. Let's go to the disad. We're going to win that states were already stripped of their power during the Trump administration, which should have triggered the global war impact. However, it didn't. This means that you should be highly skeptical of their extinction claims. During the Trump presidency, Trump stripped California's ability to control their own emission standards and forced states to become more punitive in immigration policy, both of which had been powers traditionally reserved to the states. And guess what? No global war happened because no global war happened. All they said in response to our uniqueness claim is that their evidence is specific to criminal justice, but the warrant that their evidence gives for criminal justice being important is because it is a power that was traditionally reserved to the states. The other two examples that I cited above were also powers that were traditionally reserved to the states that the federal government decided to make decisions about, and this didn't lead to any. Didn't lead to their impacts. And you can extend that there's no link. Qualified immunity is a federal law. Is a federal law that the federal government themselves pass, meaning that it's not out of their jurisdiction to repeal it. Let's go to the state's counterplan. You can extend the perm. We shield the link through the perm and access the net benefit because we do everything that the counterplan does and we still get absolvency. And the disad links back to the federalism disad. The 50 states acting in unison upsets the balance of power between the states and the federal government. The perm is preferable because the states and the federal government do the plan at the same time, which is the definition of federalism. And we're winning the uniqueness debate, which means that a global war won't occur. So you shouldn't weigh their net benefit.